In 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius erupted and buried the city of Pompeii beneath an avalanche of ash, becoming one of the most famous catastrophes in human history. Today, we have the ruins, the casts of the dying, and the streets left exactly as they were. But of the disaster itself, of the eruption as it actually happened, we have only one source, only one eyewitness account: the letters of Pliny the Younger. He was just 17 years old on the day the volcano erupted, and 27 years later, the historian Tacitus asked Pliny to write down what he remembered. What you're about to hear are the two letters he sent in reply, detailing the chaos, the heat, the screams, and the death of his uncle, who sailed towards the erupting volcano to save the people stranded on the shore. I'm David Rintoul. This is Deep Dive History, the podcast where we explore the myths, the empires, and the people that have shaped our world. And you're listening to The Man Who Watched Pompeii Die. Letter 1. I'm grateful that you have asked me to send you an account of my uncle's death, so that you may give a more accurate account of it to posterity. My uncle was stationed at Misenum, in active command of the fleet. On the 24th of August, around the 7th hour, my mother drew his attention to a cloud of unusual size and shape. He had taken a turn in the sun, then a cold bath, and after a light meal had settled down to read. Even so, he called for his sandals and climbed to a vantage point from which he could get a clear view of it. From that distance, no one could tell which mountain the cloud was rising from. Only later it was found to be Vesuvius. In shape, it resembled nothing so much as a pine tree, rising on a tall trunk and then spreading into a kind of canopy of branches. At moments it shone white, at others it was dark and mottled, according to how much earth and ash it carried up with it. To a man of my uncle's learning, this was a thing of real importance, and it called for closer study. He ordered a fast galley made ready, and offered to take me along if I wished to come. I said I would rather go on with my work, and as it happened, he had already set me some writing to do. He was leaving the house when a message reached him from Rectina, the wife of Tacitus. She was terrified by the danger bearing down on her, for her villa lay at the foot of the mountain, and there was no escape except by sea. She begged him to come to her aid. At that, he changed his purpose. What he had begun in a spirit of inquiry, he now carried through as an act of courage. He ordered the galleys launched and went aboard himself, meaning to bring help not only to Rectina, but to the many others who lived along that beautiful stretch of coast. He hurried towards the very place that everyone else was fleeing, holding a straight course, with the helm fixed on the point of danger, and was so completely without fear that he described each shift and change in the cloud as it came, and had his secretary write it down. Ash was already falling on the ships, hotter and thicker the closer they drew, and with it pumice and blackened stones, charred and cracked by the heat of the flames. Then the sea itself turned shallow beneath them, and the debris from the mountain blocked the shore. For a moment he wondered whether to turn back, but when the helmsman urged him to, he said, "Fortune favours the bold. Steer for Pomponianus." My uncle sailed in with the wind behind him and embraced Pomponianus tenderly, encouraging him and urging him to keep up his spirits. Then, to calm his friend's fears by showing how unworried he was himself, he called for a bath, and once he had bathed, sat down to supper in good cheer, or at least with every appearance of it, which was just as heroic. Meanwhile, broad sheets of flame were breaking out across Mount Vesuvius in place after place, rising high into the air and lighting up the sky, their glare all the more vivid against the darkness of the night. To calm his companions' fears, my uncle kept telling them that the country people had fled in terror and left their fires burning, and that what they saw was nothing more than empty villas ablaze. Then he went to bed and fell into a genuinely deep sleep, for his breathing, heavy and loud on account of his size, was heard by those waiting at his door. By now, though, the courtyard outside his room had filled with ash and pumice to such a depth that a moment longer and he would have had no way out. He was woken, and came out to join Pomponianus and the others who had stayed awake through the night. They debated whether to remain indoors or move into the open, for the buildings were now shaking with violent, repeated shocks, lurching back and forth as if wrenched from their foundations. Yet outside there was danger too from the falling pumice, light and burnt through though it was. Weighing the two, they chose the open ground. For my uncle it was a decision reached by reason, for the others a choice driven by fear. They tied pillows over their heads with cloths as a guard against the falling stones. Elsewhere the day had dawned by this time, but where they were it was still night, a darkness blacker and deeper than any ordinary night, which they relieved as best they could with torches and lamps of every kind. They decided to make for the shore, to see from the nearest point whether the sea would let them put out, but it was still running high and contrary. There my uncle lay down on a sailcloth spread out for him, and called twice for cold water, which he drank. Then the flames and the smell of sulphur that warned of them scattered the others in flight and roused him. He raised himself up with the help of two of his servants, and instantly fell down dead, suffocated, I believe, by some thick and poisonous vapour, for he had always had a weak throat, which was often inflamed. When daylight returned, 2 days after the last day he had seen, his body was found untouched, uninjured, and covered, dressed just as he had been in life. He looked more like a person asleep than a dead man. Meanwhile, my mother and I were at Misenum, but that is of no consequence for the purposes of history, nor did you ask to be told of anything except my uncle's death. So I will say no more, except to add that I have given you a full account both of what I witnessed myself and of what was told to me soon afterwards. You will pick out whatever best suits your purpose, for writing a letter is one thing and writing history another, and writing to a friend is not the same as writing for the public. Farewell. Letter 2. You say that the letter I wrote at your request, describing the death of my uncle, has made you anxious to know not only the terrors, but also the distress I suffered while I stayed behind at Misenum. I had indeed begun to tell you of these, but then broke off. Well, though my mind shudders at the recollection, I will essay the task. After my uncle had set out, I spent the rest of the time at my studies, since that was the very reason I had stayed behind. Afterwards I bathed, dined, and fell into a brief and restless sleep. For several days before, there had been slight shocks of earthquake, which alarmed us little, since they are common enough in Campania. But that night they grew so violent that everything around us seemed not merely shaken, but ready to collapse. My mother rushed into my bedchamber just as I myself was getting up in order to wake her if she was still asleep. We sat down in the courtyard of the house, a small space lying between the buildings and the sea. I don't know whether to call my behaviour brave or foolish, for I was only in my 18th year, but I called for a volume of Livy, and read it as though I were perfectly at ease, and even went on making my usual notes from it. Then a friend of my uncle's, who had recently come to join him from Spain, saw me sitting there beside my mother with my book, and reproached her for her patience and me for my indifference. But I paid him no heed, and continued to read my book. It was now the first hour of the day, but the light was still faint and weak. The buildings all around us were beginning to totter, and though we stood in the open, the courtyard was so narrow that we were greatly afraid, and indeed certain of being crushed by their fall. This convinced us to leave the town. A bewildered crowd followed us, for in a panic people always prefer someone else's judgment to their own, and as we set out they came pressing in a great mass behind us, urging us forward. We came to a halt once we had passed beyond the buildings, and there we were met with many strange and frightening things, for although the ground was perfectly level, the chariots we had ordered brought out were so tossed back and forth that we could not keep them steady, even by wedging them with large stones. And we saw the sea drawn back upon itself, driven out, as it were, by the shaking of the earth. The shore was certainly much widened, and many sea creatures lay stranded on the dry sand. On the other side, the black and fearsome cloud of fiery vapour burst into long, twisting, zigzag flames and gaped asunder, the flames like flashes of lightning, only far larger. Then my uncle's Spanish friend exclaimed sharply, with an air of command, to my mother and me, "If your uncle is safe, he surely wishes the same for you. But if he has perished, no doubt it was his desire that you should both outlive him. Why then do you delay your escape a moment longer?" We answered that we could not think of our own safety while we were still uncertain of his. At that, he waited no longer, but tore away as fast as he could and got clear of the danger. Soon afterwards, the cloud descended upon the earth and covered the whole bay. It encircled Capri and hid it from sight, and the promontory of Misenum was lost to us as well. Then my mother prayed, entreated, and commanded me to flee as best I could, saying that I was young and could escape, while she was old and frail, and would not fear to die, if only she knew she had not been the cause of my death. I replied that I would not save myself unless I could save her too, and so, taking firm hold of her hand, I forced her to quicken her pace. She obeyed reluctantly, blaming herself for delaying my flight. Then the ashes began to fall, but not yet thickly. I looked back, and a dense blackness was rolling up behind us, which spread over the ground and followed like a torrent. "Let us turn aside," I said, "while we can still see, in case we are thrown down on the road and trampled in the darkness by the crowd." We were still considering what to do when the blackness of night overtook us, not the blackness of a moonless or cloudy night, but the blackness of pent-up places that never see the light. You could hear the wailing of women, the screams of little children, and the shouts of men. Some were trying to find their parents, others their children, others their wives, calling for them and recognizing them only by their voices. Some lamented their own fate, others the fate of their families, while some prayed for death in sheer terror of dying. Many lifted up their hands to the gods, but more were declaring that there were no more gods, and that this night would last forever and was the end of the world. There were even those who added to the real dangers by inventing new and false terrors, for some said that part of Misenum had fallen in ruins and the rest was in flames, and though it was untrue, it found ready believers. A gleam of light now appeared, which seemed to us not so much daylight as a sign of the approaching fire. The fire stayed at a distance, but the darkness came on again, and the ashes once more fell thickly and heavily. We had to keep rising and shaking them off, or we should have been buried by them and crushed by their weight. I might boast that not one groan or cowardly cry escaped my lips, despite these dangers, had I not believed that I and the world were perishing together, a miserable consolation indeed, yet one which a mortal creature finds very soothing. At length, the blackness grew less dense and dissipated, as it were, into smoke and cloud. Then came the real light of day, and the sun shone out, but as blood-red as it appears at its setting. Our still trembling eyes saw that everything had been transformed, covered with a deep layer of ashes like snow. Making our way back to Misenum, we refreshed our bodies as best we could, and passed an anxious, troubled night, hovering between hope and fear. But our fears were heightened, for the shocks of earthquakes still continued, and many people, driven frantic by dreadful prophecies, made sport of their own calamities and those of others. For our own part, though we had already passed through perils and expected still more to come, we had no thought even then of leaving the town until we got news of my uncle. You will not read these details, which are not up to the dignity of history, as though you meant to incorporate them in your writings, and if they seem to you hardly worth being made the subject of a letter, you must take the blame yourself, since you insisted on having them. Farewell. I've been David Rintoul for Deep Dive History. Thank you for watching, and see you next time. Goodbye.